Well, what an absolute pleasure to be back at the Hertie School. It's always a pleasure to be here, and every year there seem to be even more brilliant faces in the audience. So you're definitely part of an institution on the way up. And it's a particular pleasure to be discussing this report with you. Now, I imagine if I were you and sitting listening to these 7 practices, that you might be sitting there saying, but come on, the governance of these organizations prevents even an angelic leader from having any impact. You know, surely when it comes to international organizations, it's all about the governance of it. It's about whether the United States and Europe are pushing everybody else around, or whether they've told the leader of the organization that they can do absolutely nothing. So really all I wanted to add to Nina's wonderfully clear explanation is just that last step. Well, are we ignoring governance? And I think to answer that, I would just want to highlight that this project came out of a series of discussions in a Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum. Now, the Global Agenda Council process started just after the financial crisis of 2008 with the dramatic title, Reshaping the World. And there was a consensus among the 800 academics and leaders from organizations that got together that first year that what the world needed was a complete reset. We needed to reshape global governance, start all over again. And I disagree with this view because I think it misses the point that international cooperation is really, really difficult. And it doesn't require, it's not that you've just got to stick the right guy in the cockpit or the right girl in the cockpit, and then international cooperation is going to be as fast and nimble as your corner shop. International cooperation is far more difficult than that. And so I took part chairing and organizing a group that looked at global governance. And for quite a long period, the group was mired on this governance problem. It's all about governance. Until we can get governments to agree on all of these kinds of things, then the leadership of organizations can't do anything. And so we changed tack. And we said, well, hold on, is that really true? And we started coming up with a list of the things that the leader of an international organization could do, even without the permission of the member states. And we started asking, are they using the powers that they have? And we quite quickly realized that lots of them weren't. Leaders of organizations that have powers to hire and fire, that weren't using them, that were just putting up with poorly performing teams. Leaders that could come up with operational plans that simply weren't doing so. And so out of that exercise came this project, which was to say, okay, so what are the conditions that you need in an organization if you've got some chance of good leadership? So I just want to say, we're not saying that this solves the problem of global governance, of international cooperation, or of all the problems of any international organization. What we are saying is, what hope is there for an organization to be effective if we just carelessly toss to lead the organization the person who's most convenient for one government to get rid of, or the person who's the default setting from a political organization? What hope would you have, even in a large private sector company, which in a way has a simpler performance structure? What hope would you have of having a really successful company if you never stop to think, what are the competencies we require at the top of this company, and then tried to match somebody with that competence? And likewise, what hope would you have if you weren't, as an organization, constantly striving for a better strategy and to evaluate your performance? So these things, I hope, look really obvious to you, and I hope that most of you are sitting there going, oh, but surely they all do that. Well, most surely, our report will tell you, they don't. Most do at least one thing, none do the 7. So I'll stop there and leave it to the real practitioners, and I just want to end by saying it is such an honor to be the warm-up act for Javier Solana. So over to you, sir. Over to Johanna.
Thank you, Ngaire. Before we actually give the baton to Javier, let me just kind of also ask one question to Nina and to Ngaire. I had the pleasure actually to follow this project over the years, and I remember vividly the experience of all of us there in Dubai, that in that very moment we were all tasked of rethinking the institutional arrangements of the today, and the world that came up in the discussion. We have to reboot our institutions, reboot. So obviously for me that this word rebooting triggered the question: can we really reboot something? Can we reboot institutions with good leadership? Or do we need entrepreneurship? Do we need institutional entrepreneurship in order to reboot? But I leave that question here. But the question that I have for the two of you, and I really want to also emphasize the remarkable work and also for, the project for the Global Agenda Council, to take stock of a set of practices, you can argue good governance practices that enable good leadership. The question that we all, as researchers and the scholars, always ask is, of course, what do we see? Taking stock of a repertoire of good practices. But also, we always pay attention, what is it that we don't see? So was there one thing, one practice that you didn't see while taking stock, and that you either expected or wished you had seen?
I think the thing that one of the things that we found very difficult to capture is that some leaders are much more amenable to pressure from governments, from other individuals, from forceful leaders of other international organizations than others. And we really tried to work out how we could measure the proneness to capture, whether it's from private sector organizations or just from a bullying state. But I think one of the things that we really noticed when we started looking at the leadership was just, it's perhaps personality, but some people are just much better at setting their compass and staying the course. And it's not to do with governance, and it's not to do with the rules. Clearly, they all have constraints that they have to work within. But there were some attributes that went beyond that. And we just found it really difficult to capture the sort of proneness to undue influence.
Thank you so much. Javier, your reactions to the report, but also your own insights into leadership and your own experiences.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be at Hertie again, and I hope to be seeing some of you in the coming years or in the coming months. Let me start by saying that the study that has been presented is a very important study. Not only because of the reason that have been given, that this is a very interesting year, 2015, because we have an important meeting at the United Nations at the beginning of a selection of a new Secretary General, but because in the time that we are living, the problems that we are facing are problems that do not have a simple solution, and do not have a solution that even the most important country alone can solve it. And that is something rather new. We have to go very back in history to have the possibility of a country to have the capacity to solve the problems of the globe. But today, after so many things, after the Second World War, after the reunification of Germany, after the merging of the emerging countries, etc., it's absolutely inconceivable one country to be able to resolve the serious problems that we have. Therefore, we need institutions which are able to perform that duty. Global problems, global solution, global institutions. And therefore, the global institution is now the essence of the governance of the world. Now, therefore, to make this a study and to do it rapidly and to try to take lessons from this study is fundamental. The better this institution will work, the better the world will be. as far as governance is concerned. Therefore, we are not playing with something minor, but we are talking about something very, very major today. Now, the second thing I would like to say is that when we try to look at an organization, an international organization, we try to see what is, with what we can compare international organization. And there's a temptation for some to try to compare to a very, very important multinational that has offices in Brazil and in Frankfurt and in Madrid and in Beijing, etc., a very important multinational. It may be something that may look like a global organization, but it's a very important difference that is very difficult to understand if you have not been inside in its international organization. When you have a big company, you have a board of the company, you have a CEO of the company. Normally, you choose the CEO which is in symphony with the board. You don't have a board which is in competition with the leader. Now, you as a global institution, you have around the board, the member states of that organization, they don't all have the same objective. And therefore, the CEO, the person which is in charge, the Secretary General, the Director General, has not only the responsibility to get the institution working properly outside, but he has to find also the consensus inside. And when you said that sometimes the lack of consensus inside makes it impossible for the Secretary General to act, it's true. And that is why it's so important who is the Secretary General or the Director General. Because one of the obligations of the Director General, the Secretary General, is also not only to get the common strategy outside, but to construct the common strategy with the cooperation of all the members of the board. Imagine that I have the Secretary General of NATO. The Secretary General of NATO is one of the most difficult organizations because it deals with war and peace, etc., and has unbalanced members of the board. The most important one is the United States that pays 70% of the budget or something like that, no? And you have Luxembourg, which doesn't have an army. Now, how do you get that organization to work in moments of difficulty when everybody has a vote? Everybody has a vote. How do you maintain living together, have solidarity among the members, have coherence about the members when you have so many differences inside? Well, this is something that was done, and I just going to tell you an example from my previous incarnation when I was in that position. But we had to do something very, very important. It was to get an agreement with Russia before the first enlargement of NATO. NATO was to go to enlarge to Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And we thought, or at least I thought, that could not or should not be done without having a conversation, more than a conversation, an agreement with Russia. But not everybody on the board, not every country in NATO thought that was necessary. Why? Why do we have to ask Russia, quotation mark, permission if we want to enlarge NATO? They said, well, we better do. Let's try. If we solve it, it will be better if we don't solve it. If we don't solve it, well, we'll do it. We'll see how we do. But a priori, it would have been much better to try to do that, even if country A, country B, country C said, no, this is stupidity. It's given Russia a sense of that they have the right of veto for whatever NATO does. But at the end, I won that battle. But I can tell I won battle with many countries that were with me. No, I didn't win only. But one important thing that I recall now is that to have a very solid, a very deep relationship with the members of the board, with the state members, to bring it along all the time, to talk to them all the time, to tell them that you are working for them. They have to have the feeling that you, the Secretary General, are working for their benefit, and try to convince them, etc., that really changed completely the atmosphere. And we got the agreement, the Russians accepted, and was accepted, and Javier Solana, was the one who was delegated as Secretary General of NATO to perform a negotiation, the 3 months with Yevgeny Primakov, which died not long ago. But it was really, for me, one of the most important experiences of my life, because it was not an easy task. I had to bring along countries from the United States to Luxembourg, France, Germany, etc., and to maintain them together all the time. It was very, very, very important. So it has this element of maintaining all the time the confidence of two shareholders, to maintain the back and forth. It's very time consuming. Sometimes it's horrible. You really get to bed exhausted. But this is an exhaustion that produces results. And therefore, I think that should be considered in selecting that person, somebody who is willing to take the time to work 24 hours over 24 hours, day and night, and not only on being on the newspapers and putting medals, which is this is not the Secretary General. That's another thing that I want to know. Is not the person that has to get the medals from here. The medal here had to be done for those who go to elections, and the Secretary General of any organization goes to elections, and therefore you have to do it. What you have to do it well, but let the credit take care by others. And once you have that agreement and everybody understand, I can tell you, life is way much, much easier. Now, this is a very important thing that I want to share with you. The second thing is that what structures you have inside. Sometimes the organization have a type of a structure that comes with the organization, and you cannot change much, because it's very expensive to change, not economical, but time-wise, etc. Imagine that I was leading an organization. This time I'm going to talk about my leading of the European Union. I forget NATO for a while and go to the European Union, which the same more or less can be applied to the European Union, and even sometimes, since the United States is not there, everybody seems to agree more or less the same, and the debates are really much, much more longer. But when the United States, you begin to feel that they're going to veto, but people take a little bit of a different position. But now in the European Union, you have to do it, bringing everybody around in the same manner. But I asked for something very simple. I asked for having in my private office, in my one representative from every country that were not the one who controls me, but who worked with me. And the countries responded fantastically, and I have to tell you, here in Germany, the president of this group of in that time, 11 people, which I had during 8 years, was Christoph Heusen. Christoph Heusen today is the security advisor of Chancellor Merkel for 5 years or 6 years. So he went working for me, working to Chancellor Merkel. So imagine the caliber of the person that I was able to get. And it was really very, very important. And we had to do something very difficult also. Imagine that at that time, we have to remember it is around the Iraq War. You remember that the United States put in place a security strategy with Condoleezza Rice. And that security strategy had inside a term that the Europeans, we didn't want it, which is the preemptive action. Remember, preemptive action. And we wanted to turn around that term, and we wanted to write something for the European Union, not taking that term in, of really put it in a manner that this was not in our thinking. So it was a very difficult thing, because half of the members of some members of the European Union, why don't we take the same terminology that the United States, etc. So it was a very difficult battle. And I took this group of people that I have selected from different countries, and I put to the Council of Europe one question on their table. I am willing to do this under one premise, that I can write the strategy, and you have to approve it or take me back, leave it, take it or leave it. I don't want every paragraph with a phrase from Luxembourg and a paragraph by Germany and a line from Italy and another from Spain, because it's a type of document that we produce in the European Union which is impossible to read, because you can almost read who has placed the phrase A, the phrase B, because every country's interest is in place. No, I wanted something that didn't have that sentiment of interest of different countries, but really the essence of what the European Union was able to do. And what I ask really, now that it's so fashionable to say, I got from the European Union a fast track. You remember what, you know what a fast track is, no? A fast track is when the President of the United States gives the fast track and the Senate only votes yes or no, but it cannot amend it. So I got somehow a fast track. So examples that goes all in the same direction. That I will say to finish this part, to say the Secretary General or the Director General has to get very clear in his mind that he is not the boss. If he has some dreams of being the boss, he will not be anything. And worst of all, he will not be able to do anything. Now, I finish with one reflection. Now, we are talking about global institutions and a world which is very different. We are in a multipolar world, in a world in which the global institutions, as has been said by you, the IMF is directed by a European, the World Bank by an American, the other by a British, etc., etc. Well, you have not listened any word, any country which is not part of the classical Western world. So that is something which is impossible to continue. And when we talk about these changes that are going to take place, starting from the United Nations, we have to realize that there are emerging countries that have power, that economies which are very powerful, and they have to be part of the system, of the global system. Otherwise, we will not be able to solve problems like climate change, for instance. I mean, without China, you cannot solve that. You cannot solve problems related to so many things, trade, etc. And therefore, to begin to think that we have to get these people in. And that is something that still we are not, or people are not completely prepared to do it. It has been in a vote, it was a vote in the G20 of South Korea saying yes, but that has been vetoed by some parliaments, it still has not been done. So today, China has about the same votes that a very important country, a little bit more, but then a very important country for us Europeans, which is Belgium, because it's where the European buildings are. But I mean, if you compare Belgium with China, I don't think I have to elaborate more to say that this is nonsense. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and also the remark on that we should always be reminded, no matter kind of what the organization we are talking about, the leading on behalf. So in your case, it was leading on behalf of member states. We are now turning to Thomas Bagger, which is leading on behalf of Germany and the society in Germany, but obviously also in interaction also with multilaterals and other member states of the EU. We look forward to your remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity of commenting. I have to say I haven't worked in an international institution and I haven't studied in Oxford. So I guess I'm really just part of one of those difficult governance structures, indeed, that make life difficult for an international institution. So I'll limit my comments to three brief points. The first is, I mean, all the 7 best practices are eminently sensible, so why not why are they not universally spread across international institutions and organizations? And I'll comment on number 1 and number 5. Sort of the question of leadership on merit is eminently sensible. But I think, and on that, Javier Solana has already said something or touched on something that's very important. And I think you did as well when you said, there was something that was difficult to capture, which had to do with sort of in the end, a very personal skill or a personality issue. In the chapter that you have on selecting and re-electing leadership on merit, there's also quite a bit of talk about independence. So only a leader of an international organization that's chosen, that's elected on the basis of merit, can be independent and lead the organization to the best of its abilities. But there is an issue with the question of independence in an international organization. And I think that's a point that since I haven't worked on the inside, I have a sort of a more abstract perspective than what Javier Solana has said. But I would say the leader of an international institution is it's a very precarious position. You know, it's not something where you stand and you say, this is my ground and I own it. And as long as I sit in this chair or I stand at this lectern, I will tell where this organization is going. That's just not the way it works, for the very reasons that Javier Solana has alluded to. There is a board, and there's a board that's not united. So what you have to do as a leader is you have to manage the limited consensus of the member states, and then you have to try to expand that consensus, sort of the field of common interest of your board members, of your stakeholders. And in order to do that well, you've used a wonderful expression that sort of you have to maintain a deep relationship with every member of the board. And you've explicitly called it deep relationship, even though you said there were plenty that I had to tell that I can't take their position fully into account if I wanted to if I want to take the organization forward. Now, how do you square that circle? Well, you do it through social skills. You do it through personality. You give them the impression that you do take their interest into account, even if in this particular issue, question, decision that needs to be taken, you know, their point has to stand back in the interest of the overall movement of the organization forward. So you have to be the one who prevents, not through mechanism, but through personality, the danger of of the exercise of veto power that countries hold in the board, the public appearance of disunity, which not only damages country X or Y, but damages the institution you're supposed to lead and damages your own leadership credentials. So I think that point, you need backing from the member states, you need buy-in from the member states. How do you get that? You don't only get that through independence, and you don't only get that because you are you have the professional skills, the sort of merit-based, that you know what you're talking about. You have there's a deep personality aspect involved in that, whether you call that charisma or just personality, but don't underestimate it for making international institutions work. The second point on setting strategic priorities, number 5. Now, all academics and all policy planners like myself, we all love strategic documents, and we think there should be more of those, and there has to be more clarity in the action of institutions and large organizations. And something I have learned is that these kinds of processes through which you set strategic priorities are indeed processes, and they're not only about documents. So don't only look whether an institution has produced a piece of paper that sets out its mission statement or a strategy plan for the next 5 years, and as Nina said in her introduction, whether that sets measurable measurable targets. I think Javier has elaborated, what it took in 2003 to write a European security strategy, and it's only now that we're writing a sequel to it or a new version of it. So it's had quite a lifespan. But one of the things you have to say, if you look at what was set as a goal in that security strategy, to build a stable and prosperous neighborhood of Europe, and you look at the ring of fire that we're surrounded now today, would you say that that strategy has failed, or that the institution has failed because it was not able to deliver? So don't overestimate, don't think that you can always put international relations into quantifiable, measurable sort of components and then measure your own performance against it. So as a foreign ministry, I think we struggle with the question of how do we do a proper performance assessment for diplomacy. It's a real, but not because we're not open to have that discussion, but because it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think the institutions that you were looking at, they vary because they do very different things. I think it's easier to do some of these things for a development bank, where you measure it against sort of the lending and sort of repayment of grants and loans and so forth. But for a foreign ministry or for a body like the European Union or NATO, I think it's just an extremely difficult thing to do. But one more thing about strategic priorities, because I said it's not only about a document. I think one of the big challenges that you have, and I know that only from my own organization and through that review 2014 process that we went through, you're not only trying to present sort of a sense of direction to the outside, you're also trying to give a sense of purpose and a sense of direction for your own staff, for the people who work with you. And that means it has to be a participatory process that not only mimics participation, but that gives people a real buy-in, that they feel that they are heard, that they have a say in the direction and the implementation of the goals that you set. There are plenty of tools that you can use. I think more and more organizations are moving in that direction. I can see it with a lot of fellow foreign ministries around Europe and around the globe, because the environment is changing so quickly. There are more actors in foreign policy, in other ministries of the government, in non-state actors and so forth. So there are new issues that come up, from epidemics to cyber to climate and so forth, for which we in foreign ministries are no longer the experts. So what does that mean for our interaction with other actors on the scene, both in and outside of government? Plenty of things to talk about. But if you don't get your own staff to really think through these questions, then in the end, just a top-down document will not give you what you really need, which is a sense of purpose within the organization. And I can only imagine that doing something like that with an international organization must be even more difficult, because the question of loyalty, the question of commitment to the organization, if you owe your own employment to sometimes a kind of quota or an established tradition that position X and Y is filled by country Z, is an even more difficult thing to do. And so I think that's one of the critical elements in this strategic priority setting. Yes, it should happen, but you do it early in a tenure. You don't do it at the end of a tenure as a leader, or at the end of a legislature. You have to do it early. Do it in a participatory way and pay as much attention to the process as to the outcome document if you want to have any effect on it. Final comment on sort of on the study and the way it looks at improving leadership of international organizations. I think there's, as I said, they're all eminently sensible, but they have a tendency to focus on mechanisms and instruments. So there's an element here of we can somehow improve structures and processes, and my own sense is it makes a huge difference what kind of personality sits at the top of an organization. And I'll just leave you with that quote that has stayed with me from Jean Monnet, who said, "Nothing is possible without people, and nothing endures without institutions." So the challenge is how you bring those two together and not just focus only on the institutional side and the institutional setup, and then your leader will somehow function like a perfect machine because you've set all the parameters in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for this. Reminded us that at times it's useful to think about the necessary conditions, but then also think about the sufficient conditions. So governance practices that enable good leadership might be necessary conditions, but they are not sufficient. And I think you bringing the people back in is a very important one. It reminded me of, and here I'm actually standing on the shoulder of giants, reminded me of Philip Selznick, who was one of the first very important organizational theorists who made the distinction between an organization and an institution. And the distinction is really institutions are infused with value. So to use your parlance is infusing purpose. I think that's definitely something that we should not underestimate, especially in times like this when what Javier also mentioned, that institutions will be critical for going for the next route. I know that the report that you have, you might have seen, that you have heard of, is just a starting point of a more of a programmatic approach to actually address leadership in multilateral organization that both Ngaire and also Nina are embarking on. So I would really like to give you the opportunity to also probe into, interrogate more, taking advantage of actually us having Javier and Thomas here on the floor. So I would like you to start off with the questions you might have, answers, ideas.
Well, it's really interesting to be here on this panel, particularly because we've had a workshop today that actually spoke to some of the things, the questions that Thomas just posed about how do we actually measure the meaningful impacts of organizations and leaders and not just focus on easy things for us to study, like we can look at a strategic document and see whether or not they have clear measurable goals, but the question of how the process of arriving there, the internal process, and how it's followed up is really important. So there's actually a number of people in the room from this workshop of practitioners who are thinking about how do we evaluate organizational performance. So I just wanted to note that in the question and answer, that there are a number of other people in the room as well who've got a lot of experience in these areas. And I guess one of the questions I would have is, are any of these reforms just not implementable at all? Would you push back and say, this isn't something that we can realize? Because interestingly, in the current debate about the UN Secretary General, some people are saying, even merit-based can be controversial. There's also a trade-off in that context of people saying we want to see the first woman Secretary General. We also want it to be merit-based. We also want to have regional rotation. How do we square off these things? And so I would, I guess, be interested in continuing that conversation about how you balance the selection process of being meritocratic, as well as acknowledging that the leader is accountable back to a range of member states.
Yes, thank you both. That was fabulous. I mean, that was a masterclass in leadership from both the officials present. And if I had to sort of distill down one of the most important attributes of leadership to which they're referring, it's the ability to have those who work above you, with you, and below you trust you. It's trust. And and that these 7 things are actually proxies of that, because they're the next best thing to trying to see if somebody has that capacity, the capacity not to be liked, but actually to make the long-term decision that strengthens the institution, rather than the short-term easy deal which results in popularity. It's whether the person leading the organization has the patience that Javier Solana spoke of, not just to sit and listen to people, but actually to hear what they're saying and to communicate to them that they understand what they've just heard. They understand what those concerns are. one of the best advice to leaders I've ever heard is if you really want to persuade somebody, listen harder. It's also the most difficult to take into account in action. So I guess my question, because I think trust captures a lot of these things, that the member states at the board table, the more they trust you as somebody who will do what's the long-term right thing to do, the more they'll be prepared to sacrifice some of their own narrow interest and support you on what you're trying to do. The more your outside stakeholders trust you, the more information they will share with you, the more they will help you to define good, positive priorities for the organization. And so on it goes. So here's my question. If we were trying to measure trust, so if we took the candidates for the UN Secretary General and we said, how do we measure this quality? How could we measure which of these is most likely to command the trust of member states, of staff of the organization, stakeholders beyond it? But I didn't say the popularity. I didn't say win the vote. I didn't say, oh yes, he's a great guy. I see him on the golf course 5 days a week when he's supposed to be running an international organization. It's how would we measure who is the most trustable leader of the candidates presenting themselves? How would each of you do that if you had to score them, out of 10 on trustability?
I think that if you have to, it's not an easy thing to do, to choose on the basis of whatever can be trust. But I think that you don't become Secretary General of the United Nations from being a professor of mathematics in a college. You are already have been on some activities where people have seen you act. You have a network of people that have trusted you or distrust you, or you have a wound with somebody, but we don't have to choose from the vacuum. We have to choose among people who really a priori will qualify, and so at that point it's a little bit less difficult, but it continues to be very difficult. And trust is something that can be faked very well, and you can really find somebody you think is trustful and it happens not to be. Now, you put an example that I'd like to underline. For instance, in the European Union, we didn't have intelligence. Intelligence in the sense we didn't have the MI6 and we thought, say we because we're several people thinking that we need a little bit of deep information. Let's put it that way. We didn't want to have spies, but we would need to remember that we did a war in the Balkans, and you have to know much more than what was coming in the newspapers, and it was a moment in which 3 or 4 big countries with power in the field of intelligence came to me and said, well, we're going to share with you. You are now one, you are going to have as much as we do. Now, that is a big responsibility, because of course I could not say everybody, I got this from your fellow minister, which is next door to you or next chair to you. You don't know it, and I know it because it was told by somebody else, who hasn't told you. So it's a very difficult situation. I can talk about now because it's 20 years ago. But this is the type of thing which, as an example, is absolutely necessary. And I think who had that also. I think that in a way, Kofi Annan had that sense. Maybe then he had problems with his son or whatever, but it had that in. I met Kofi Annan when he was Deputy Secretary of the United Nations. He's somebody who came from the bureaucracy of the United Nations, but he did very well and was able to construct this sentiment of trustful person, a dignity in his behavior and all that.
We go to Thomas in a second, but I just wanted to share a reflection. We also today here, we talk about leadership, and we often restrict ourselves to think about selecting the next leader, the next leader of the UN or so on. And I think a pretty good predictor for that is actually, you mentioned trust, but how we social scientists actually measure trust is network studies, no? And I think that's a pretty good predictor in terms of who will be selected. But it doesn't say anything about how this person actually uses the power that she or he has adopted. And so also the issue of trust is something how you actually also use trust and build trust while in the position. One thing is get to the position, but then also how it plays out. But Thomas, would you like to speak to?
No, I don't think I have anything meaningful to add. I'd like to, but I don't. But on your last point, I mean, there's not only the variation that you have, you've selected someone because you thought he would be the right person for the job, who then either abused the trust or didn't fulfill the expectations or ruined the international organization, more or less. We've seen all of that. But you also have the other surprise. You have people who quite remarkably grow on the job. And I think, because you mentioned Kofi Annan, who, in the end was an imposing figure coming from the bureaucracy of the United Nations, and suddenly he was in this role that was certainly no longer a bureaucratic role, but really a leadership and political role, and quickly outgrew the limitations of a, let's call it a bureaucratic upbringing or something like that. So that happens as well, and it just shows you how difficult, I mean, you have that in national political context as well, obviously, but it shows you how difficult it is to make that decision either through a properly designed selection or election process among member states, where you have a rational or interest-driven national vote, or whether you have an open election by an open electorate, one man, one woman, one vote. And you can also fail, or you can be pleasantly surprised. So that I don't have a good answer to your question. How does the trust question relate to these 7 best practices, and do they actually deliver that? I don't know. I think I would just counsel also a sense of humility, because in the end you don't know what power and position do to people. You can just try to minimize the surprise in some or minimize the bad surprise in some way.
Thank you, Thomas. We will open up the discussion now, but before we do so, I would like to give the word to Helmut. You had a question?
I did, yes. Thank you. Yeah, it's the 7 points you have there. I was wondering, in looking at the organizations, I think there were about 8 or 10 organizations, right? Which one did perform best when you looked at the 7? You must have had a distribution of some sort, and I think, Ngaire, you hinted at it, but you didn't quite reveal it. The second question I have is the process of succession that you didn't address, and I was wondering about that, because we have some international organizations that spend an extraordinary amount of time in finding the next person to run it, and they lose so much energy by doing that. So can you recommend a process that, or a time frame by which we should have the succession?
Look, a couple of things that I think most people would find surprising. To understand where we started from and thinking about this. A large number of even large and powerful international organizations have not actually defined the role of the CEO. So they go out to look for candidates without having even defined what they expect the candidate to do or to have as core competencies. Okay, that's pretty important. And then the despair one feels going into even a large, well-organized and ostensibly well-run organization to discover that the new head of it, this is some time ago, so I'm not referring to anyone in the contemporary international scene, is simply flying in 1 or 2 days a week after 2 years on the job, doesn't even know what the 4 main departments of the organization are, right? This is, you know, if this is leadership, what hope is there for these organizations? So it's just to sort of underscore that and say, you know, actually the fact that Kofi Annan knew the United Nations well and had a track record of being an extremely diligent, hard-working man within that, well trusted by his colleagues, all of that was quite a lot of evidence about what would come next. The leader that I was just talking about actually had quite a track record of recklessness, of not really doing the job. And you know, so it was there for people to see. We set out, so Nina and a team of researchers valiantly tried to score the organizations. That was where we began. We were going to score them and try and rank them. And we very quickly, for 2 different reasons, decided not to do that. One was that there was just it was too difficult for the scores to have a meaning that was significant. So you could apply these scores, but then what did it really mean when you started adding them up and comparing the organizations? And the second thing was that actually a lot of international organizations have picked up and used the report because it simply points to some practices. It's not trying to shame organizations, nor is it trying to applaud those who might have taken some window dressing measures in these areas, but that haven't really followed through. So rather, we thought it was a more sensible way to engage with organizations was to say, look, you might not realize it, but you could do it this way, and here are some others that are doing it this way. So we saw that as a more constructive way to engage.
On the timing, I think that 2 periods is necessary, well, it's okay, and more is too much. I think 2 periods, 8 years or whatever is the period, I think this is enough length for really deliver, but I wouldn't go much longer than that.
Oh, I forgot, on that issue, on reappointment is an interesting issue, because if you've been appointed by European countries, and then they also have the power to reappoint you for a second term of 5 years, well, ask yourself, is that person equally accountable to all the membership? Well, not in their personal job contract, they're not. So I think we didn't address that in the report, and we should have. We should have, if I would put my hat right behind yours, so 8 years, 1 term, and then you're out.
Would you like to respond to this, or shall we get the next?
I think we should go to the next question.
Great. So yes, there was a gentleman here in the 4th row. Ngaire will sneak out in about 5 minutes. So just for you to not be kind of taking this as the symbol that something is wrong.
Yeah, I'll just stand up.
Please also introduce yourself.
Myself, I'm Julius Morke. I'm a member of the Young Leaders for Health. It's a young initiative dealing with global health. My question would be regarding the best practices. I would consider them as all rather technical practices, and I think that technical practices can be misused because they can dilute political underlying processes, and I would think they should be twinned with political practices as well. And I think that's actually where I see some part of the trust issue. The trust doesn't only have something to do with a personality, which is sometimes hard to judge, but I think trust has something to do with the process as well, and I think there comes transparency in it. So maybe that's very controversial if you talk about diplomacy, but I would ask what you think about enabling leaders to put a much higher emphasis on the political processes and actually really make them open and transparent, and what you think could that do with the trust issue you were talking about?
Is there anyone who wants to take this question? Otherwise, we take 3 questions and then we ask the panel to react to that. So the first question, the second question, let's go to the other side here.
Hello, I'm Giulio Del Balzo, I'm 21 and I come from Milan, Italy. I am first year MPP student here at the Hertie School of Governance. I wanted to know how many kinds of leaderships do you see in international organizations, and which are the strongest kind and the weakest kind that you see emerging in this period? Second question about values. This best practice present standards. I would like to know also values that these leaders might accompany to the expression of their leadership within international organization. And to value, I would mention also vision. I think that there can't be any leadership without a vision for international organization. And I'm sure that as we have different leaders, we have different visions. So
we got the question. We don't
okay.
need, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. A third question in the back, yes. Yes, next to you. There was a hand up.
Thank you. Mareike Kleine, London School of Economics. 2 quick questions. The first one would be that are there any differences in leadership at the domestic level and the international level? Do you see this as a much bigger challenge, actually? The second is that I was wondering where the incentives are. If you compare leadership at the domestic level, then domestic leaders, they often have career incentives. There's always another bigger job that they could have, whereas at the international level, of course, with the exception of Javier Solana, they tend to be elderly men at the end of their career. So they no longer really have an incentive to do great, right? That might make them independent, but perhaps not push beyond 100%. So my question would be, what incentives could we set instead of, or in lieu of career incentives at the international level to make leaders really push?
Thank you. 3 wonderful questions that all in a way speak to the 3 panelists that are still here. Nina, would you like to start with the first question, perhaps?
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much for all of those questions. I think they light up some important issues for us to discuss more broadly about reform of international institutions. So on the first question of political practices and how we would twin them with what was described as sort of the more technical reforms, I agree. I think that there are some really important political changes that need to be made. And in fact, some of the starting point, as Ngaire was describing, was that we do need some political changes, particularly in the way governance and boards are managed. So some of the conversations we were having today about multilateral effectiveness was exactly on this topic of how do we ensure that member states deliver enough financing to their organizations that they're funding that's discretionary. And this was one of the points picked up. So often international organizations are hampered because all of the money they're getting is earmarked. So they have no discretion. Say when the WHO was faced with the Ebola crisis, it couldn't respond adequately because it didn't have a way to move money into that area. So the short answer to your question is yes, we do need to see political reform as well. This report is biting off a first bite, and there are obviously much broader conversations that need to be had too.
Thank you. Javier? Questions?
Yes, I would like to answer the local versus global leader. It's very difficult to, because I will start by saying something very capital letters. That distinction between global and local leaders has to finish. I cannot see a local leader or a leader leading a country which has not a global vision. This is over. The world is global, all are interdependent, and if you want to be a local leader, probably you don't have any future in your life. You have to be a local global or a global local. But if you want to be local, full stop. Now, second, on incentives. I would not be in favor of incentives at the end of a mandate. In order to get better people, because at the end of the day, if you don't go back home to be prime ministers, they will not be frustrated. I think that whatever goes for 8 years of their life, leading, doing his job and working hard for the international organization, I think that you don't have to incentivize because of the purchase that you're going to give it at the end to come at the beginning. If that is what he asks, he doesn't deserve, he will not be chosen.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yeah, maybe on the first question, sort of the political processes and the trust and transparency, well, juxtaposition. I mean, it's just something that strikes me from diplomatic processes, that transparency does not necessarily make political processes better. And if I go back to Ngaire's point about there are lots of international organizations that have not even explicitly, sort of have not put in writing or made explicit what the task of that leader should be. So they elect someone for the organization, but they rather keep the question of what do we expect from this person, what is he or she supposed to do, they keep that to themselves, and they will figure that out later as we come to the problems that the organization will face. If you want to move ahead on that, if you want to sort of be more explicit, if you want to put something in writing, if you want to make clear for what kind of vision, what kind of goals you're actually selecting a leader, well, you will have to put these board members, these stakeholders, into a room, and they'll have to hammer out sort of a common idea of what they think about this institution. And doing that in a transparent way will not help the process necessarily. It's nothing against transparency as a principle, but I think you have to find out where it helps the outcome and where it doesn't. And just making everything transparent does not necessarily produce a broader set of consensus or allows you to expand a certain area of consensus among board members, among member states that have very different ideas of whether they like the institution, whether they would like it to expand its mandate, whether they would rather constrain its mandate. It's very different ideas and perspectives. So I'll take your point about the political nature of all of this. And that's why, what you study and what I try to do is such a great thing to do, because it is in many ways the only serious game for grown-ups. But part of that fun and part of that difficulty and that challenge is exactly that it does not have precisely defined rules, and once you've set them all in stone, things will run smoothly. That's just not how the world operates. And so the political is part of international organizations and institutions, and there are things you can do to make them better. And transparency, for example, I think in accountability, sort of not reappointing someone who has clearly failed in his job. I think we've become better on that in international organizations, because the cost is higher for member states to just recklessly push their own guy, even though if it's quite clear that he's not, or he or she is not up to the job. So it's higher cost today than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So there is there's a case to be made for transparency in that sense, but it's not universally good. And if you talk about bringing the political idea back in, which I think is true. That would be my argument. Don't look at it too mechanistically, too mechanically. But then you will have to live with the fact that some of the most important trade-offs some of the most important trust issues between the board members can only be resolved behind closed doors.
Thank you. I just wanted to briefly kind of attend also to your question, because I truly believe that values will become much more important and also play a much more important role for leadership at multilateral organization, and not just kind of the values that guide the leadership, but also how a leader can orchestrate different sets of values. The current crisis really shows also in the EU, we might not even talk about one set of values. So a leader really also has to actually use the image that I had in mind when listening to Javier, be the leader as a conductor, be able to actually also orchestrate different sets of values. We are approaching the end of this session. Allow me to take advantage of the panel that we have here and ask both Javier and Thomas one question that really speaks to this really incoming group that we have. We inaugurated 10 days ago a new program, the Master of International Affairs. And I would like to come back, Thomas, to your point of necessary and sufficient conditions, and more attend to the quality of a leader, the personal characteristic of a leader. I would like to ask the two of you, if we kind of go forward 20 years, what do you think are the quality of a leader that will be at the head of a multilateral organization in 20 years' time? What do our students actually have to pay attention to in order to prepare themselves?
I will dare to start. I am very obsessed with I'm very interested in the concept of global citizenship. It doesn't mean global nationality, but global citizenships. That means that everyone has to behave as a global citizen and be a provider of global goods, not only a consumer of global goods. And that is, to me, one of the most beautiful reflections that I like to do nowadays. How we do provide global goods, and how we handle the global goods, how we profit from the global goods, how to defend the global goods. So for me, I would like to see the leaders of tomorrow. I mean, I would like to see the leaders of today, but the leaders of tomorrow, without any doubt, a concern with this concept, global goods. Providers, consumers, how to handle that global goods well. At the end is being a global citizen. Thank you.
Thomas?
I think I would echo that, in the sense that you have to have a global vision, as you called it, but when you look at an individual organization or institution, if you're at the top of that, you have to be able to sort of contextualize. You have, in this world which is so complicated, so complex, what is it that you bring to, not just in the management of the organization, but in the positioning of the organization and in its sense of direction? And I think this question of sort of being able to articulate, but then also to inspire and to instill a sense of direction is absolutely critical. And knowledge alone is not enough in order to be able to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina, for this wonderful report and getting us started. And thank you, Javier and Thomas, for joining us here. Thank you, all of you, for coming, and see you soon.